Let's come back to this shot of Leon. So remember, with this behind the scenes, we had this big key in the middle of them. So they're essentially both looking into it. It was because it was so large and behind and above them, it essentially gave us the three-dimensionality that we're looking for the key in one go. But it would have been and was way too high on that truss to be giving us these little catch lights here. So that's why in that wider behind the scenes shot, you'd see there were several other lights set up. One back here and over kind of behind the guest in order to act as a little catch light for Leon, and also to just bring up the level a little bit for that A-cam, which is very tricky to light for that A-cam, for that central two shot. And then one over behind his shoulder to act as a kind of bit of fill and a catch light for Tara. But that's why this is actually off to the side, because it's actually acting as a catch light for her, but also simultaneously they're moving it into more of a kicker position. And actually I think that works well, and probably would have been something I'd done anyway. Without it, we would have started to lose Leon's arm with a black top on. It would have started to disappear into the background. So again, we're creating those layers, but also with his dark skin, that just brings a little bit of pop of contrast, just helps stand him out and bring him out from the background. Now, this was a particularly challenging shoot because the brief was to recreate a podcast being shot with Canon's N500 PTZ range. So it's sample footage. The idea is that this footage is shown to potential customers to show what can be done with his cameras. Talk about a poison chalice as a gig. You know, I'm essentially being told that you need to make this look good, otherwise it will impact sales of this camera. So it's like, okay, so what can we do? There's all kinds of sort of art direction things that I could talk about, but just focusing on the lighting side of things. Those PTZ cameras, they're kind of unique in terms of historically PTZ cameras had tiny little sensors. They were pretty unique when they came out because they had 3rd-inch sensors. They had much larger sensors than these types of PTZ cameras typically had. So that does create a much nicer image, and you do have the ability to get a little bit of shallow depth of field out of them. Having said that, it's still 1/3 of an inch. It's not like it's a full frame sensor. So I was conscious of the fact that we wanted to be able to see the background. It's all carefully kind of curated props to kind of go with the look of it. Does anyone, even though you wouldn't have ever seen this before, does anyone know what I was trying to go for when I shot this podcast? Has anyone ever seen Diary of a CEO podcast? So we were trying to make it sort of iconic enough to instantly recognise, oh, this is a podcast, by essentially mimicking and paying homage to a very popular podcast. So from the wardrobe to the set design, the bookcase behind, these are all sort of nods towards the way that Diary of a CEO is put together. But I didn't, even though we're at the longer end of the lens, in it's shallow-ish, it's not shallow enough that, for example, you can't read the book titles and things like that. So I wanted to do just a little bit more work to make sure that there was that sense of depth. So that's why I was really making sure that I had this backlight and this kicker just to give this separation. Otherwise it would have gone against me. It would have flattened it out again and made the sensor have that very subtle but subconscious feeling on the viewer that this is sort of a cheap video kind of look, which it really isn't. The other thing that I've done to try and draw our attention is to create as much high contrast as possible around my subject. And this is where we move from this depth idea to this compositional idea with lighting. And when you're planning your lighting, you should be thinking, what can I do with my lighting to aid the composition? Okay? There's the framing of the camera, which will follow certain rules or break certain rules, and there'll be certain considerations with the framing of the camera. But what can you do with the lighting to help that? What can you do to support that? So this is a fairly straightforward, it's a slightly loose medium close-up, and we've got Leon placed on the third, you know, his eye line is pretty classically set up. But as I said, because of the slightly smaller sensor and not wanting people to be distracted with the book titles and things, I wanted to really make the most and draw the eye line across. So I'm supporting the composition by supporting where, or helping to steer where the viewer looks. And the way that we can do that is we can play on a very simple thing, which is that the human visual system is designed to seek out areas of high contrast, and to do that almost sort of instantly, as soon as you behold a scene. And that, so I'm just going to turn this down because I realise that's probably very bright in a lot of your faces and you probably can't see very clearly, so apologies. So that's a feature of our vision, and it helps our brains be able to judge if our vision is clear, if we can focus, or if there's an issue with our vision. So our brains kind of latch onto these areas of high contrast first. In fact, there was a really interesting experiment done many years ago where little iris trackers were placed on people, and they wanted to know where people looked when they looked at paintings or photographs. They want to see where do they look first, and how do they then start to move out and decode the composition in front of them. And the area of highest contrast would always be, or if there were eyes, or importantly, if those were also high contrast, which is where our catchlight is quite important, would draw the attention immediately first, and then the eyes would start to almost sort of spiral out, except it was more of a kind of come back. There'd always be this kind of coming back to where they started, but you would sort of move out almost like this through the image. By adding areas of high contrast around your subject or where your subject's eyes are, you're really reinforcing the composition, and you're drawing the viewer's attention and hopefully getting them to ignore other parts of the frame that you might not want. So I've, as well as the catchlight here and the kicker here just pulling out Leon, I've also got these practicals behind him. Got two practicals. One's a aperture bulb just in that lamp, and there's also a little, I think it was in fact the MC Pro, not my own Roscoe LED, but one of these small little LED panels, which was just to the side in the bookcase, and it was just kicking in to the edge of the glass vials that you can see there. And those vials, the art department had actually put those further down. I think these were the other way around. And I just noted them, thought of the specular highlights that we'd get from them, and brought them up so that we essentially create this line through and flank Leon. So I'm drawing the eye with the practicals as much as possible. The thing about practicals is the dynamic range of your camera, as good as the best cameras are, these bare bulb sources can very quickly clip and look unattractive. So by using, we had these on a Bluetooth, I think it's just on an iPad, just Bluetooth connected, and adjusting them, we're able to dim them right down. So although this looks nice and bright and natural, obviously in reality when you looked at that, it's like, why is that lamp so low? Like, it's ridiculously low. But actually that was sat just under 100 IRE on our Rec 709 reference. And that actually introduces another technical complexity of this shoot, which was Canon didn't want me to be producing anything that was highly worked on in post, because they wanted it to be authentic, and this is out of camera, because these PTZ cameras are often used for live shoots. And so this is the final image. This was captured actually using Ninjas, recorded straight out the cameras, and the cameras record Rec 709. They can actually output log, but I specifically wanted to capture the completely unadulterated Rec 709 image and essentially what you would see if you were live streaming this. So this is lit to a Rec 709, 10-ish stop delivery. So being able to have complete control and dim all this down and place it, using a light meter or charts to make sure that everything fell nicely in that dynamic range was more of a concern than you'd even potentially have normally, but falls in quite nicely. Let's look at some other examples. This is Peter Morgan's The Crown. You may recognise it. The DOP was Adriano Goldman. I think there were several DOPs, but I know he did the majority of the shows. And I think this is a really good show to look at in terms of practicals and lighting sources within the frame, because it's often shot in very large, very wide spaces. And you can see, for example, here they're using, well, there's the fire obviously, but there's also these lamps that have been placed. It's no coincidence their proximity to the talent, their height difference, which mimics the height difference of the talent. It's relying on our function of vision to seek out these areas of high contrast and explore around them first. So it's really helping us identify our characters within a very large frame. And in fact, they can get even larger than this as well within this show. There's some very big spaces. And as the frame gets bigger and the rooms get bigger, they rely more and more on these heavily diffused windows to break into the scene. And again, this is quite an extreme example, but I think it shows it so beautifully, where we're meant to be looking over here, and in fact the light intersects the subject matter, And you can see how dark this is. Like, don't look here, look here. But there's action going on in these areas. And it really reinforces this idea that the girls are playing whilst all of the sort of attendants are doing stuff in the background to the sides, and using the window as the practical in this particular case. So areas of high contrast, they're going to draw the eye, and practicals are going to help support your composition. I'm just going to jump back a little bit, back to depth again. And as I said at the beginning, there's so much overlap with these, it's almost impossible to put it in a presentation where it's linear and we move from one to the other. There is a huge overlap. But I'm just going to pop back to depth again, but specifically this time, this is that same hideaway shoot I was talking about before. But looking at it from a slightly different point of view. So before we were talking about the backlighting from the angle that we had, but actually that light was in fact the key for the main angle, which is where the camera was not round here, but round at the front of the bar. And I wanted to just break down that setup because it's quite relevant to the idea of depth. So we've talked about depth in terms of, chiaroscuro, in terms of Rembrandt triangle. We've talked about how backlights can help with depth. What we can also look at is colour and colour contrast, and how that can support depth as well. Colour contrast, and I'm going to use a very classic example here of kind of warm colours and cool colours, but colour contrast is another way that we can use lighting, and of course this can be reinforced with the grade as well, but using it in camera in lighting to create separation from our background. The problem I had with this particular setup was that it was an incredibly small bar. The distance from the bar to where Adam was making the cocktails to the back of the bar was about 2 meters at the most. So I had a space where it was very difficult to add depth. So I'm using a really wide open, I think the whole thing was shot on a 50mm f1.2, really very shallow depth of field to try and hide the fact that we're in a small space. But then using other little tricks as well to try and do that. So one of which was the colour contrast. So in the back of the bar, behind Adam, I placed a Astera Titan tube, just a longish LED tube, and matched it to the colour temperature of the north-facing overcast window light, the sunlight that was coming through this window, which was about 6,500, 7,000 Kelvin, I seem to remember. So these were matched together, and letting this natural light north-facing window kind of come in behind, and then all of my lighting, the key and such light, was then at the front. And it was split into two. So I've actually got, this is his main key, my Gemini 1x1, big softbox on it, egg crate to try and stop as much spill from hitting the rest of the bar as possible to really kind of hone in on him ideally. But then also using this little mirror to bounce light into a very specific area. So I alluded earlier to when I was talking about the backlight, using flags to cut out light from places you don't want. But I did say, though, there's also a technique you can use to very specifically light just a small section. And mirrors are the easiest way of doing this. So I wanted to get a little splash of light. The framing actually starts further back and it's focused on these little bottles of ingredients at the front. It looks like kind of an apothecary. It's an incredible little setup he's got there. So I wanted to really highlight the kind of artisan nature of what he was doing. So I've got this flash of light that was picking out these little specular highlights on the jars at the front. And that was achieved by having my other Gemini just on the floor, face up, and just bouncing that off a little small mirror. What's cool about that is the light that you then get reflected, it will only be as big as the mirror is. So if you're doing tabletop stuff, product stuff, and you need a little patch of light in a very small area, then you just use a small mirror. And in this case, I just wanted something sort of that sort of size, just to come across here, but to not interfere with Adam's key or the light that's on Adam. So that was the way that lighting was achieved. But that color contrast, I think it does a good job because you end up with these cooler colors at the front, and then the warmer colours of his skin, also choosing certain items as well in terms of props, the warmer copper coloured measure he's using, the red shirt. So these warm colours are coming out. That's just a simple conversation ahead of time to make sure that things play out how we want them to, but then there's cooler colours in the shadows and behind to create this depth. Now the reason that works is because our eyes rather have evolved to pay very little attention to blues. Only about 1% of our colour vision is responsible for looking at short wavelength light, which is the blue frequencies. And the reason is simple, that blue is the rarest colour in nature. There's very little flora and fauna that's blue. And in fact, the thing that's most blue most of the time is the sky, which of course is inconsequential to our survival in terms of, eating and procreating and things like that. So we actually have pretty much tuned it out as background noise. We've tuned out those dominant sky blues, and only 1% of our vision is looking in those short wavelengths. So 99% of our vision is more over towards our greens, yellows, reds. How that manifests itself is that we pay, subconsciously, we devalue and deprioritize cooler colours. So they naturally recede from our consciousness, from our attention. So anything that's cooler will be deregulated, if you like, deprioritized. Conversely, warm colours, particularly flesh colours, blood colours, will stand out to us. We'll pay a huge amount of attention to them, not just because we have a big overlap with our medium and long wavelength cones in our eye, but also because, as I said before, we're a societal animal. Our evolution is based around coming together and building things as a society, although it sometimes doesn't feel that way, but that is ideally what we're meant to be doing. And so we seek out and we recognise there's actually biological reflexes that we have. So our blood pressure increases, our heart rate slightly increases when we see warmer colours. It's a biological thing that we can tap into, so these colours stand out to us. So if you've got cool and warm colours together, it's another way of forcing depth. Now, on its own, it might not do a huge amount, but in conjunction with those other things I've talked about to create depth, you can see how you can start to actually create and hit your goal of breaking through this two-dimensional barrier and really creating something immersive that people feel involved in and sort of enveloped in, even if it's some little social media ad for a bar. This is another one, cooler in the background, warmer in the front. This was something I did for light panels a while back. But the only reason I've got it in here is just to talk about how you can use a technique known as shooting off temperature to also do this. So even if you have quite simple bicolour lights, or only a small range of adjustment in terms of colour, or even fixed daylight lights, but you have some gels, you can force warmer colours to be warmer and cooler areas to be cooler by setting your camera's white balance in between two values. So here I've got a situation where I've deliberately rated the camera's white balance several hundred Kelvin away from the true temperature of the sources that are in this scene. So the background was set to 3200 Kelvin, whereas the light on the talent is set to 2700, and then the camera was set to 2900. But you could also do this much further away. So you could go 6532 or 5632 and rate your camera at 4000 or 4900, or you can start to mess around with this. As your camera's white point's in the middle, it pushes the others further down that blue-yellow axis, that Kelvin line. So you end up pushing this sort of silvery blue into the background and then these warmer skin colours into the foreground. And it's a very old-fashioned technique, but it's one that is useful to employ if you don't have the benefit of modern full RGB LEDs.